Section 42 of Unbeaten Tracks in Japan by Isabella L. Bird. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Availle in September 2012. Letter 35. Ginzainoma, Yezo, August 17. I am once again in the wilds. I am sitting outside an upper room built out almost over a lonely lake, with wooded points purpling and still shadows deepening in the sinking sun. A number of men are dragging down the nearest hillside the carcass of a bear which they have just dispatched with spears. There is no village, and the busy clatter of the cicada and the rustle of the forest are the only sounds which float on the still evening air. The sunset colors are pink and green, on the tinted water lie the waxen cups of great water lilies, and above the wooded heights the pointed, craggy, and altogether naked summit of the volcano of Komonotaki flushes red in the sunset. Not the least of the charms of the evening is that I am absolutely alone, having ridden the 18 miles from Hakodate without Ito or an attendant of any kind, have unsaddled my own horse, and by means of much politeness and a dexterous use of Japanese substantives, have secured a good room and supper of rice, eggs, and black beans for myself, and a mash of beans for my horse, which, as it belongs to the kaitakushi and has the dignity of iron shoes, is entitled to special consideration. I am not yet off the beaten track, but my spirits are rising with the fine weather, the drier atmosphere, and the freedom of Yezo. Yezo is to the main island of Japan what Tipperary is to an Englishman, Berra to a Scotchman, away down in Texas to a New Yorker, in the rough, little known, and thinly peopled, and people can locate all sorts of improbable stories here without much fear of being found out, of which the Ainus and the misdeeds of the ponies furnish the staple, and the queer doings of men and dogs, and adventures with bears, wolves, and salmon, the embroidery. Nobody comes here without meeting with something queer, and one or two tumbles either with or from his horse. Very little is known of the interior, except that it is covered with forest matted together by lianas, and with an undergrowth of scrub bamboo impenetrable except to the axe, varied by swamps equally impassable, which give rise to hundreds of rivers well stocked with fish. The glare of volcanoes is seen in different parts of the island. The forests are the hunting grounds of the Ainus, who are complete savages in everything but their disposition, which is said to be so gentle and harmless that I may go among them with perfect safety. Kindly interest has been excited by the first foray made by a lady into the country of the aborigines, and Mr. Eusden, the consul, has worked upon the powers that be with such good effect that the governor has granted me a shomon, a sort of official letter or certificate, giving me a right to obtain horses and coolies everywhere at the government rate of 6 sen a ri, with a prior claim to accommodation at the houses kept up for officials on their circuits, and to help and assistance from officials generally. And the governor has further telegraphed to the other side of Volcano Bay desiring the authorities to give me the use of the government kuruma as long as I need it, and to detain the steamer to suit my convenience. With this document, which enables me to dispense with my passport, I shall find travelling very easy, and I am very grateful to the consul for procuring it for me. Here, where rice and tea have to be imported, there is a uniform charge at the yadoyas of 30 sen a day, which includes 3 meals, whether you eat them or not. Horses are abundant, but are small, and are not up to heavy weights. They are entirely unshod, and, though their hoofs are very shallow and grow into turned-up points and other singular shapes, they go over rough ground with facility at a scrambling run of over 4 miles an hour, following a leader called a front horse. If you don't get a front horse and try to ride in front, you find that your horse will not stir till he has another before him, and then you are perfectly helpless, as he follows the movements of his leader without any reference to your wishes. There are no mago, a man rides the front horse and goes at whatever pace you please, or, if you get a front horse, you may go without anyone. Horses are cheap and abundant. They drive a number of them down from the hills every morning into corrals in the villages, and keep them there till they are wanted. Because they are so cheap, they are very badly used. I have not seen one yet without a sore back, produced by the harsh pack saddle rubbing up and down the spine as the loaded animals are driven at a run. They are mostly very poor looking. As there was some difficulty about getting a horse for me, the consul sent one of the kaitakushi saddle horses, a handsome, lazy animal, which I rarely succeeded in stimulating into a heavy gallop. Leaving Ito to follow with the baggage, I enjoyed my solitary ride and the possibility of choosing my own pace very much, though the choice was only between a slow walk and the lumbering gallop aforesaid. I met strings of horses loaded with deer hides, and overtook other strings loaded with sake and manufactured goods, and in each case had a fight with my sociably inclined animal. In 2 villages I was interested to see that the small shops contained lucifer matches, cotton umbrellas, boots, brushes, clocks, slates, and pencils, engravings in frames, kerosene lamps, and red and green blankets, all but the last, which are unmistakable British shoddy, being Japanese imitations of foreign manufactured goods, more or less cleverly executed. The road goes uphill for 15 miles, and, after passing Nanai, a trim Europeanized village in the midst of fine crops, one of the places at which the government is making acclimatization and other agricultural experiments, it fairly enters the mountains, and from the top of a steep hill there is a glorious view of Hakodate Head, looking like an island in the deep blue sea, and from the top of a higher hill, looking northward, a magnificent view of the volcano with its bare, pink summit rising above 3 lovely lakes densely wooded. These are the flushed scores and outbreaks of bare rock for which I sighed amidst the smothering greenery of the main island, and the silver gleam of the lakes takes away the blindness from the face of nature. It was delicious to descend to the water's edge in the dewy silence amidst balsamic odours, to find not a clattering grey village with its monotony, but a single irregularly built house with lovely surroundings. It is a most displeasing road for most of the day, sides with deep corrugations, and in the middle a high causeway of earth, whose height is being added to by hundreds of creels of earth brought on ponies' backs. It is supposed that carriages and wagons will use this causeway, but a shying horse or a bad driver would overturn them. As it is at present, the road is only passable for pack horses, owing to the number of broken bridges. I passed strings of horses laden with sake going into the interior. The people of Yezo drink freely, and the poor Ainus outrageously. On the road I dismounted to rest myself by walking uphill, and, the saddle being loosely girthed, the gear behind it dragged it round and under the body of the horse, and it was too heavy for me to lift on its back again. When I had led him for some time, 2 Japanese with a string of pack horses loaded with deer hides met me, and not only put the saddle on again, but held the stirrup while I remounted, and bowed politely when I went away. Who could help liking such a courteous and kindly people? Mori, Volcano Bay, Monday. Even Ginzainoma was not paradise after dark, and I was actually driven to bed early by the number of mosquitoes. Ito is in an excellent humour on this tour. Like me, he likes the freedom of the Hokkaido. He is much more polite and agreeable also, and very proud of the governor's shomon, with which he swaggers into hotels and transport offices. I never get on so well as when he arranges for me. Saturday was grey and lifeless, and the ride of 7 miles here along a sandy road through monotonous forest and swamp, with the volcano on one side and low wooded hills on the other, was wearisome and fatiguing. I saw 5 large snakes all in a heap, and a number more twisting through the grass. There are no villages, but several very poor tea houses, and on the other side of the road long sheds with troughs hollowed like canoes out of the trunks of trees, containing horse food. Here nobody walks, and the men ride at a quick run, sitting on the tops of their pack saddles with their legs crossed above their horses' necks, and wearing large hats like coal scuttle bonnets. The horses are infested with ticks, hundreds upon one animal sometimes, and occasionally they become so mad from the irritation that they throw themselves suddenly on the ground and roll over load and rider. I saw this done twice. The ticks often transfer themselves to the riders. Mori is a large, ramshackle village near the southern point of Volcano Bay, a wild, dreary-looking place on a sandy shore, with a number of joroyas and disreputable characters. Several of the yadoyas are not respectable, but I rather like this one, and it has a very fine view of the volcano, which forms one point of the bay. Mori has no anchorage, though it has an unfurnished pier 345 feet long. The steam ferry across the mouth of the bay is here, and there is a very difficult bridle track running for nearly 100 miles round the bay besides, and a road into the interior. But it is a forlorn, decayed place. Last night the inn was very noisy, as some travellers in the next room to mine hired geishas, who played, sang, and danced till 2 in the morning, and the whole party imbibed sake freely. In this comparatively northern latitude the summer is already waning. The seeds of the blossoms which were in their glory when I arrived are ripe, and here and there a tinge of yellow on a hillside, or a scarlet spray of maple, heralds the glories and the coolness of autumn. Yubetsu, Yezo. A loud yell of "Steamer!" coupled with the information that she should not wait 1 minute, broke in upon Go and everything else, and in a boiling sun we hurried down to the pier, and with a heap of Japanese, who filled 2 scows, were put on board a steamer not bigger than a large decked steam lounge, where the natives were all packed into a covered hole, and I was conducted with much ceremony to the forecastle, a place at the bow 5 feet square, full of coils of rope, shut in, and left to solitude and dignity, and the stare of 8 eyes, which perseveringly glowered through the windows. The steamer had been kept waiting for me on the other side for 2 days, to the infinite disgust of 2 foreigners who wished to return to Hakodate, and to mine. It was a splendid day, with foam crests on the wonderfully blue water, and the red ashes of the volcano, which forms the south point of the bay, glowed in the sunlight. This wretched steamer, whose boilers are so often sick that she can never be relied upon, is the only means of reaching the new capital without taking a most difficult and circuitous route. To continue the pier and put a capable good steamer on the ferry would be a useful expenditure of money. The breeze was strong and in our favour, but even with this it took us 6 weary hours to steam 25 miles, and it was 8 at night before we reached the beautiful and almost landlocked bay of Mororan, with steep wooded sides and deep water close to the shore, deep enough for the foreign ships of war which occasionally anchor there, much to the detriment of the town. We got off in overcrowded sampans, and several people fell into the water, much to their own amusement. The servants from the different yadoyas go down to the jetty to tout for guests with large paper lanterns, and the effect of these, one above another, waving and undulating with their soft-coloured light, was as bewitching as the reflection of the stars in the motionless water. Mororan is a small town very picturesquely situated on the steep shore of a most lovely bay, with another height, richly wooded, above it, with shrines approached by flights of stone stairs, and behind this hill there is the first Aino village along this coast. The long, irregular street is slightly picturesque, but I was impressed both with the unusual sight of loafers and with the dissolute look of the place, arising from the number of joroyas, and from the number of yadoyas that are also haunts of the vicious. I could only get a very small room in a very poor and dirty inn, but there were no mosquitoes, and I got a good meal of fish. On sending to order horses, I found that everything was arranged for my journey. The governor has sent his card early, to know if there were anything I should like to see or do, but as the morning was grey and threatening, I wished to push on, and at 9:30 I was in the kuruma at the inn door. I call it the kuruma, because it is the only one, and is kept by the government for the conveyance of hospital patients. I sat there uncomfortably and patiently for half an hour, my only amusement being the flirtations of Ito with a very pretty girl. Loiterers assembled, but no one came to draw the vehicle, and by degrees the dismal truth leaked out that the 3 coolies who had been impressed for the occasion had all absconded, and that 4 policemen were in search of them. I walked on in a dawdling way up the steep hill which leads from the town, met Mr. Akboshi, a pleasant young Japanese surveyor, who spoke English and stigmatized Mororan as the worst place in Yezo, and after fuming for 2 hours at the waste of time, was overtaken by Ito with the horses, in a boiling rage. "They're the worst and wickedest coolies in all Japan," he stammered. "2 more ran away, and now 3 are coming, and have got paid for 4, and the first 3 who ran away got paid, and the expressman's so ashamed for a foreigner, and the governor is in a furious rage." Except for the loss of time, it made no difference to me, but when the kuruma did come up, the runners were 3 such ruffianly-looking men, and were dressed so wildly in bark cloth, that, in sending Ito on 12 miles to secure relays, I sent my money along with him. These men, though there were 3 instead of 2, never went out of a walk, and, as if on purpose, took the vehicle over every stone and into every rut, and kept up a savage chorus of "He sha, he sora" the whole time, as if they were pulling stone carts. There are really no runners out of Hakodate, and the men don't know how to pull, and hate doing it. Mororan Bay is truly beautiful from the top of the ascent. The coast scenery of Japan generally is the loveliest I have ever seen, except that of a portion of windward Availle, and this yields in beauty to none. The irregular grey town, with a grey temple on the height above, straggles round the little bay on a steep wooded terrace. Hills densely wooded, and with a perfect entanglement of large-leaved trailers, descend abruptly to the water's edge. The festoons of the vines are mirrored in the still waters, and above the dark forest, and beyond the gleaming sea, rises the red, peaked top of the volcano. Then the road dips abruptly to sandy swellings, rising into bold headlands here and there, and for the first time I saw the surge of 5,000 miles of unbroken ocean break upon the shore. Glimpses of the Pacific, an uncultivated, swampy level quite uninhabited, and distant hills mainly covered with forest, made up the landscape till I reached Horobets, a mixed Japanese and Ainu village built upon the sand near the sea. In these mixed villages the Ainus are compelled to live at a respectful distance from the Japanese, and frequently outnumber them, as at Horobets, where there are 47 Ainu and only 18 Japanese houses. The Ainu village looks larger than it really is, because nearly every house has a kura, raised 6 feet from the ground by wooden stilts. When I am better acquainted with the houses I shall describe them. At present I will only say that they do not resemble the Japanese houses so much as the Polynesian, as they are made of reeds very neatly tied upon a wooden framework. They have small windows and roofs of a very great height, and steep pitch, with the thatch in a series of very neat frills, and the ridge poles covered with reeds and ornamented. The coast Ainos are nearly all engaged in fishing, but at this season the men hunt deer in the forest. On this coast there are several names compounded with betsu or petsu, the Ainu for a river, such as Horobetsu, Yubetsu, Mombetsu, etc. I found that Ito had been engaged for a whole hour in a violent altercation, which was caused by the transport agent refusing to supply runners for the kuruma, saying that no one in Horobetsu would draw one, but on my producing the shomon, I was at once started on my journey of 16 miles with 3 Japanese lads, Ito riding on to Shiraoi to get my room ready. I think that the transport offices in Yezo are in government hands. In a few minutes 3 Ainos ran out of a house, took the kuruma, and went the whole stage without stopping. They took a boy and 3 saddled horses along with them to bring them back, and rode and hauled alternately, 2 youths always attached to the shafts, and a man pushing behind. They were very kind and so courteous, after a new fashion, that I quite forgot that I was alone among savages. The lads were young and beardless, their lips were thick, and their mouths very wide, and I thought that they approached more nearly to the Eskimo type than to any other. They had masses of soft black hair falling on each side of their faces. The adult man was not a pure Aino. His dark hair was not very thick, and both it and his beard had an occasional auburn gleam. I think I never saw a face more completely beautiful in features and expression, with a lofty, sad, far-off, gentle, intellectual look, rather that of Sir Noel Paton's Christ than of a savage. His manner was most graceful, and he spoke both Aino and Japanese in the low musical tone which I find is a characteristic of Aino speech. These Ainos never took off their clothes, but merely let them fall from one or both shoulders when it was very warm. The road from Horobetsu to Shiraoi is very solitary, with not more than 4 or 5 houses the whole way. It is broad and straight, except when it ascends hills or turns inland to cross rivers, and is carried across a broad swampy level, covered with tall wild flowers, which extends from the high beach thrown up by the sea for 2 miles inland, where there is a lofty wall of wooded rock, and beyond this the forest-covered mountains of the interior. On the top of the raised beach there were Aino hamlets, and occasionally a nearly overpowering stench came across the level from the sheds and apparatus used for extracting fish oil. I enjoyed the afternoon thoroughly. It is so good to have got beyond the confines of stereotyped civilization and the trammels of Japanese travelling to the solitude of nature and an atmosphere of freedom. It was grey, with a hard dark line of ocean horizon, and over the weedy level the grey road, with grey telegraph poles along it, stretched wearisomely like a grey thread. The breeze came up from the sea, rustled the reeds, and waved the tall plumes of the Eulalia japonica, and the thunder of the Pacific surges boomed through the air with its grand deep bass. Poetry and music pervaded the solitude, and my spirit was rested. Going up and then down a steep wooded hill, the road appeared to return to its original state of brushwood, and the men stopped at the broken ridge of a declivity, which led down to a shingle bank and a foam-crested river of clear blue-green water, strongly impregnated with sulphur from some medicinal springs above, with a steep bank of tangle on the opposite side. This beautiful stream was crossed by 2 round poles, a foot apart, on which I attempted to walk with the help of an Aino hand, but the poles were very unsteady, and I doubt whether anyone, even with a strong head, could walk on them in boots. Then the beautiful Aino signed to me to come back and mount on his shoulders, but when he had got a few feet out, the poles swayed and trembled so much that he was obliged to retrace his way cautiously, during which process I endured miseries from dizziness and fear, after which he carried me through the rushing water, which was up to his shoulders, and through a bit of swampy jungle and up a steep bank, to the great fatigue both of body and mind, hardly mitigated by the enjoyment of the ludicrous in riding a savage through these Yezo waters. They dexterously carried the kuruma through, on the shoulders of 4, and showed extreme anxiety that neither it nor I should get wet. After this we crossed 2 deep, still rivers in scows, and far above the grey level and the grey sea the sun was setting in gold and vermilion-streaked green behind a glorified mountain of great height, at whose feet the forest-covered hills lay in purple gloom. At dark we reached Shiraoe, a village of 11 Japanese houses, with a village of 51 Ainu houses, near the sea. There is a large yadoya of the old style there, but I found that Ito had chosen a very pretty new one, with 4 stalls open to the road, in the centre one of which I found him, with the welcome news that a steak of fresh salmon was broiling on the coals; and as the room was clean and sweet, and I was very hungry, I enjoyed my meal by the light of a rush in a saucer of fish oil as much as any part of the day. Sarufuto. The night was too cold for sleep, and at daybreak, hearing a great din, I looked out, and saw a drove of fully 100 horses all galloping down the road, with 2 Ainos on horseback, and a number of big dogs after them. Hundreds of horses run nearly wild on the hills, and the Ainos, getting a large drove together, skilfully head them for the entrance into the corral, in which a selection of them is made for the day's needs, and the remainder, that is, those with the deepest sores on their backs, are turned loose. This dull rattle of shoeless feet is the first sound in the morning in these Yezo villages. I sent Ito on early, and followed at 9 with 3 Ainos. The road is perfectly level for 13 miles, through gravel flats and swamps, very monotonous, but with a wild charm of its own. There were swampy lakes with wild ducks and small white water lilies, and the surrounding levels were covered with reedy grass, flowers, and weeds. The early autumn has withered a great many of the flowers, but enough remains to show how beautiful the now russet plains must have been in the early summer. A dwarf rose, of a deep crimson colour, with orange medlar-shaped hips as large as crabs, and corollas 3 inches across, is one of the features of Yezo, and besides there is a large rose-red convolvulus, a blue campanula with tiers of bells, a blue monk's hood, the Aconitum japonicum, the flaunting Callistegia soldanella, purple asters, grass of Parnassus, yellow lilies, and a remarkable trailer whose delicate leafage looked quite out of place among its coarse surroundings, with a purplish-brown campanulate blossom, only remarkable for a peculiar arrangement of the pistil, green stamens, and a most offensive carrion-like odour, which is probably to attract it to a very objectionable-looking fly, for purposes of fertilisation. We overtook 4 Aino women, young and comely, with bare feet, striding firmly along, and after a good deal of laughing with the men, they took hold of the kuruma, and the whole 7 raced with it at full speed for half a mile, shrieking with laughter. Soon after we came upon a little tea-house, and the Ainos showed me a straw package and pointed to their open mouths, by which I understood that they wished to stop and eat. Later we overtook 4 Japanese on horseback, and the Ainos raced with them for a considerable distance, the result of these spurts being that I reached Tomakomai at noon, a wide, dreary place, with houses roofed with sod, bearing luxuriant crops of weeds. Near this place is the volcano of Tarumai, a calm-looking grey cone, whose skirts are draped by tens of thousands of dead trees. So calm and grey had it looked for many a year that people supposed it had passed into endless rest, when quite lately, on a sultry day, It blew off its cap and covered the whole country for many a mile with cinders and ashes, burning up the forests on its sides, adding a new covering to the Tomakomai roofs, and deposing fine ash as far as Cape Erimo, 50 miles off. At this place the road and telegraph wires turn inland to Satsuporo, and a track for horses only turns to the northeast and straggles round the island for about 700 miles. From Mororan to Sarufuto there are everywhere traces of new and old volcanic action, pumice, tufas, conglomerates, and occasional beds of hard basalt, all covered with recent pumice, which, from Shiraoi eastwards, conceals everything. At Tomakomai we took horses, and, as I brought my own saddle, I have had the nearest approach to real riding that I have enjoyed in Japan. The wife of a Satsuporo doctor was there, who was travelling for 200 miles astride on a pack saddle, with rope loops for stirrups. She rode well, and vaulted into my saddle with circus-like dexterity, and performed many equestrian feats upon it, telling me that she should be quite happy if she were possessed of it. I was happy when I left the beaten track to Satsuporo, and saw before me, stretching for I know not how far, rolling sanding machirs like those of the Outer Hebrides, desert-like and lonely, covered almost altogether with dwarf roses and campanulas, a prairie land on which you can make any tracks you please. Sending the others on, I followed them at the Yezo scramble, and soon ventured on a long gallop, and revelled in the music of the thud of shoeless feet over the elastic soil, but I had not realized the peculiarities of Yezo steeds, and had forgotten to ask whether mine was a front horse, and just as we were going at full speed we came nearly up with the others, and my horse, coming abruptly to a full stop, I went 6 feet over his head among the rose bushes. Ito, looking back, saw me tightening the saddle girths, and I never divulged this escapade. After riding 8 miles along this breezy belt, with the sea on one side and forests on the other, we came upon Yubetsu, a place which has fascinated me so much that I intend to return to it, but I must confess that its fascinations depend rather upon what it has not than upon what it has, and Ito says that it would kill him to spend even 2 days there. It looks like the end of all things, as if loneliness and desolation could go no farther. A sandy stretch on 3 sides, a river arrested in its progress to the sea, and compelled to wander tediously in search of an outlet by the heightened mass of the beach thrown up by the Pacific, a distant forest belt rising into featureless wooded ranges in shades of indigo and grey, and a never-absent consciousness of a vast ocean just out of sight, are the environments of 2 high lookouts, some sheds for fish oil purposes, 4 or 5 Japanese houses, 4 Ainu huts on the top of the beach across the river, and the grey barrack, consisting of a polished passage 80 feet long, with small rooms on either side, at one end a gravelled yard, with 2 quiet rooms opening upon it, and at the other an immense daidokoro, with dark recesses and blackened rafters, a haunted-looking abode. One would suppose that there had been a special object in setting the houses down at wary distances from each other. Few as they are not all inhabited at this season, and all that can be seen is grey sand, sparse grass, and a few savages creeping about. Nothing that I have seen has made such an impression upon me as that ghostly, ghastly fishing station. In the long grey wall of the long grey barrack there were many dismal windows, and when we hooted for admission a stupid face appeared at one of them and disappeared. Then a grey gateway opened, and we rode into a yard of grey gravel with some silent rooms opening upon it. The solitude of the 30 or 40 rooms which lie between it and the kitchen, and which are now filled with nets and fishing tackle, was something awful, and as the wind swept along the polished passage, rattling the fusuma and lifting the shingles on the roof, and the rats careered from end to end, I went to the great black daidokoro in search of social life, and found a few embers and an andon, and nothing else but the stupid-faced man deploring his fate, and 2 orphan boys whose lot he makes more wretched than his own. In the fishing season this barrack accommodates from 200 to 300 men. I started to the seashore, crossing the dreary river, and found open sheds much blackened, deserted huts of reeds, long sheds with a nearly insufferable odour from cauldrons in which oil had been extracted from last year's fish, 2 or 3 Ainu huts, and 2 or 3 grand-looking Ainus, clothed in skins, striding like ghosts over the sandbanks, a number of wolfish dogs, some log canoes or dugouts, the bones of a wrecked junk, a quantity of bleached driftwood, a beach of dark grey sand, and a tossing expanse of dark grey ocean under a dull and windy sky. On this part of the coast the Pacific spends its fury, and has raised up at a short distance above high water mark a sandy sweep of such a height that when you descend its seaward slope you see nothing but the sea and the sky, and a grey curving shore, covered thick for many a lonely mile with fantastic forms of whitened driftwood, the shattered wrecks of forest trees, which are carried down by the innumerable rivers, till, after tossing for weeks and months along with wrecks of ships and drifting spars uplifting on the desolate rainy seas, ever drifting, drifting, drifting on the shifting currents of the restless main, the toiling surges cast them on Yubets beach, and all have found repose again. A grim repose. The deep boom of the surf was music, and the strange cries of sea-birds and the hoarse notes of the audacious black crows were all harmonious, for nature, when left to herself, never produces discords either in sound or colour. End of section 42. Of Unbeaten Tracks in Japan by Isabella L. Bird. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Availle in September 2012. Letter 35, Part 2. Sarufuto. No, nature has no discords. This morning, to the far horizon, diamond-flashing blue water shimmered in perfect peace, outlined by a line of surf which broke lazily on a beach scarcely less snowy than itself. The deep, perfect blue of the sky was only broken by a few radiant white clouds, whose shadows trailed slowly over the plain on whose broad bosom 1,000 corollas, in the glory of their brief but passionate life, were drinking in the sunshine. Wavy ranges slept in depths of indigo, and higher hills beyond were painted in faint blue on the dreamy sky. Even the few grey houses of Yubets were spiritualized into harmony by a faint blue veil which was not a mist, and the loud croak of the loquacious and impertinent crows had a cheeriness about it, a hearty mockery, which I liked. Above all, I had a horse so good that he was always trying to run away, and galloped so lightly over the flowery grass that I rode the 17 miles here with great enjoyment. Truly, a good horse, good ground to gallop on, and sunshine make up the sum of enjoyable travelling. The discord in the general harmony was produced by the sight of the Ainus, a harmless people without the instinct of progress, descending to that vast tomb of conquered and unknown races which has opened to receive so many before them. A mounted policeman started with us from Yubets, and rode the whole way here, keeping exactly to my pace, but never speaking a word. We forded one broad, deep river, and crossed another, partly by fording and partly in a scow, after which the track left the level, and, after passing through reedy grass as high as the horse's ears, went for some miles up and downhill, through woods composed entirely of the Ailanthus glandulosus, with leaves much riddled by the mountain silkworm and a ferny undergrowth of the familiar Pteris aquilina. The deep shade and glancing lights of this open copsewood were very pleasant, and as the horse tripped gaily up and down the little hills, and the sea murmur mingled with the rustle of the breeze, and a glint of white surf sometimes flashed through the greenery, and dragonflies and butterflies in suits of crimson and black velvet crossed the path continually like living flashes of light, I was reminded somewhat, though faintly, of windward Availle. We emerged upon an Aino hut and a beautiful placid river, and 2 Ainos ferried the 4 people and horses across in a scow, the third wading to guide the boat. They wore no clothing, but only one was hairy. They were superb-looking men, gentle and extremely courteous, handing me in and out of the boat, and holding the stirrup while I mounted, with much natural grace. On leaving, they extended their arms and waved their hands inwards twice, stroking their grand beards afterwards, which is their usual salutation. A short distance over shingle brought us to this Japanese village of 63 houses, a colonization settlement, mainly of samurai from the province of Sendai, who are raising very fine crops on the sandy soil. The mountains, 12 miles in the interior, have a large Ainu population, and a few Ainos live near this village and are held in great contempt by its inhabitants. My room is on the village street, and, as it is too warm to close the shoji, the aborigines stand looking in at the lattice hour after hour. A short time ago Mr. von Siebold and Count Diesbach galloped up on their return from Biratori, the Aino village to which I am going, and Count Diesbach, throwing himself from his horse, rushed up to me with the exclamation, "Les puces! Les puces!" They have brought down with them the chief, Benri, a superb but dissipated-looking savage. Mr. von Siebold called on me this evening, and I envied him his fresh, clean clothing as much as he envied me my stretcher and mosquito net. They have suffered terribly from fleas, mosquitoes, and general discomfort, and are much exhausted, but Mr. von Siebold thinks that, in spite of all, a visit to the mountain Ainos is worth a long journey. As I had expected, they have completely failed in their explorations, and have been deserted by Lieutenant Kreitner. I asked Mr. von Siebold to speak to Ito, in Japanese, about the importance of being kind and courteous to the Ainos, whose hospitality I shall receive, and Ito is very indignant at this. "Treat Ainos politely," he says. "They're just dogs, not men." And since he has regaled me with all the scandal concerning them which he has been able to rake together in the village. We have to take not only food for both Ito and myself, but cooking utensils. I have been introduced to Benri, the chief, and though he does not return for a day or 2, he will send a message along with us which will ensure me hospitality. ILB. End of section 43. Of Unbeaten Tracks in Japan by Isabella L. Bird. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Availle in September 2012. Letter 36, Part 1. Aino Hut, Biratori, August 23rd. I am in the lonely Aino land, and I think that the most interesting of my travelling experiences has been the living for 3 days and 2 nights in an Aino hut, and seeing and sharing the daily life of complete savages, who go on with their ordinary occupations just as if I were not among them. I found yesterday a most fatiguing and over-exciting day, as everything was new and interesting, even the extracting from man, who have few if any ideas in common with me, all I could extract concerning their religion and customs, and that through an interpreter. I got up at 6 this morning to write out my notes, and I have been writing for 5 hours, and there is shortly the prospect of another savage séance. The distractions, as you can imagine, are many. At this moment a savage is taking a cup of sake by the fire in the center of the floor. He salutes me by extending his hands and waving them towards his face, and then dips a rod in the sake and makes 6 libations to the god, an upright piece of wood with a fringe of shavings planted in the floor of the room. Then he waves the cup several times towards himself, makes other libations to the fire, and drinks. 10 other men and women are sitting along each side of the fire hole. The chief's wife is cooking, the men are apathetically contemplating the preparation of their food, and the other women, who are never idle, are splitting the bark of which they make their clothes. I occupy the guest seat, a raised platform at one end of the fire, with the skin of a black bear thrown over it. I have reserved all I have to say about the Ainos till I had been actually among them, and I hope you will have patience to read to the end. Ito is very greedy and self-indulgent, and whimpered very much about coming to Biratori at all. One would have thought he was going to the stake. He actually borrowed for himself a sleeping mat and futons, and has brought a chicken, onions, potatoes, French beans, Japanese sauce, tea, rice, a kettle, a stew pan, and a rice pan, while I contented myself with a cold fowl and potatoes. We took 3 horses and a mounted Aino guide, and found a beaten track the whole way. It turns into the forest at once on leaving Sarufuto, and goes through forest the entire distance, with an abundance of reedy grass higher than my hat on horseback along it, and, as it is only 12 inches broad and much overgrown, the horses were constantly pushing through leafage soaking from a night's rain, and I was soon wet up to my shoulders. The forest trees are almost solely the Ailanthus glandulosus and the Selkova keaki, often matted together with a white-flowered trailer of the Hydrangea genus. The undergrowth is simply hideous, consisting mainly of coarse, reedy grass, monstrous docks, the large-leaved Polygonum cuspidatum, several umbelliferous plants, and a ragweed which, like most of its gawky fellows, grows from 5 to 6 feet high. The forest is dark and very silent, threaded by its narrow path, and by others as narrow, made by the hunters in search of game. The main road sometimes plunges into deep bogs, at others is roughly corduroyed by the roots of trees, and frequently hangs over the edge of abrupt and much-worn declivities, in going up one of which the baggage horse rolled down a bank fully 30 feet high, and nearly all the tea was lost. At another the guide's pack saddle lost its balance, and man, horse, and saddle went over the slope, pots, pans, and packages flying after them. At another time my horse sank up to his chest in a very bad bog, and as he was totally unable to extricate himself, I was obliged to scramble upon his neck and jump to terra firma over his ears. There is something very gloomy in the solitude of this silent land, with its beast-haunted forests, its great patches of pasture, the resort of wild animals which haunt the lower regions in search of food when the snow drives them down from the mountains, and its narrow track, indicating the single file in which the savages of the interior walk with their bare, noiseless feet. Reaching the Sarufutogawa, a river with a treacherous bottom, in which Mr. von Siebold and his horse came to grief, I hailed an Aino boy who took me up the stream in a dugout, and after that we passed through Biroka, Saruba, and Mina, all purely Aino villages, situated among small patches of millet, tobacco, and pumpkins, so choked with weeds that it was doubtful whether they were crops. I was much surprised with the extreme neatness and cleanliness outside the houses. Model villages they are in these respects, with no litter lying in sight anywhere, nothing indeed but dog troughs, hollowed out of logs, like dugouts, for the numerous yellow dogs which are a feature of Aino life. There are neither puddles nor heaps, but the houses, all trim and in good repair, rise clean out of the sandy soil. Biratori, the largest of the Ainu settlements in this region, is very prettily situated among forests and mountains, on rising ground, with a very sinuous river winding at its feet, and a wooded height above. A lonelier place could scarcely be found. As we passed among the houses, the yellow dogs barked, the woman looked shy and smiled, and the men made their graceful salutation. We stopped at the chief's house, where, of course, we were unexpected guests, but Shinondi, his nephew, and 2 other men came out, saluted us, and with most hospitable intent helped Ito to unload the horses. Indeed, their eager hospitality created quite a commotion, one running hither and the other thither, in their anxiety to welcome a stranger. It is a large house, the room being 35 by 25, and the roof 20 feet high, but you enter by an ante-chamber in which are kept the millet mill and other articles. There is a doorway in this, but the inside is pretty dark, and Shinondi, taking my hand, raised the reed curtain bound with hide, which concealed the entrance into the actual house, and, leading me into it, retired a footstep, extended his arms, waved his arms inwards 3 times, and then stroked his beard several times, after which he indicated by a sweep of his hand and a beautiful smile that the house and all it contained were mine. An aged woman, the chief's mother, who was splitting bark by the fire, waved her hands also. She is the queen regnant of the house. Again taking my hand, Shinondi led me to the place of honor at the head of the fire, a rude movable platform 6 feet long by 4 broad, and a foot high, on which he laid an ornamental mat, apologizing for not having at that moment a bearskin wherewith to cover it. The baggage was speedily brought in by several willing pairs of hands. Some reed mats 15 feet long were laid down upon the very coarse ones which covered the whole floor, and when they saw Ito putting up my stretcher, they hung a fine mat along the rough wall to conceal it, and suspended another on the beams of the roof for a canopy. The alacrity and instinctive hospitality with which these men rushed about to make things comfortable were very fascinating, though comfort is a word misapplied in an Aino hut. The women only did what the men told them. They offered food at once, but I told them that I had brought my own, and would only ask leave to cook it on their fire. I need not have brought any cups, for they have many lacquer bowls, and Shinondi brought me on a lacquer tray a bowl full of water from one of their 4 wells. They said that Benri, the chief, would wish to make his house my own for as long as I cared to stay, and I must excuse them in all things in which their ways were different from my own. Shinondi and 4 others in the village speak tolerable Japanese, and this of course is the medium of communication. Ito has exerted himself nobly as an interpreter, and has entered into my wishes with a cordiality and intelligence which have been perfectly invaluable, and though he did growl at Mr. von Siebold's injunctions regarding politeness, he has carried them out to my satisfaction, and even admits that the mountain Ainos are better than he expected. But, he added, they have learned their politeness from the Japanese. They have never seen a foreign woman, and only 3 foreign men, but there is neither crowding nor staring as among the Japanese, possibly in part from apathy and want of intelligence. For 3 days they have kept up their graceful and kindly hospitality, going on with their ordinary life and occupations, and though I have lived among them in this room by day and night, there has been nothing which in any way could offend the most fastidious sense of delicacy. They said they would leave me to eat and rest, and all retired but the chief's mother, a weird witch-like woman of 80, with shocks of yellow-white hair, and a stern suspiciousness in her wrinkled face. I have come to feel as if she had the evil eye, as she sits there watching always, and forever knotting the bark thread like one of the Fates, keeping a jealous watch on her son's 2 wives, and on other young women who come in to weave, neither the dullness nor the repose of old age about her, and her eyes gleam with a greedy light when she sees sake, of which she drains a bowl without taking breath. She alone is suspicious of strangers, and she thinks that my visit bodes no good for her tribe. I see her eyes fixed upon me now, and they make me shudder. I had a good meal seated in my chair on the top of the guest seat to avoid the fleas, which are truly legion. At dusk Shinondi returned, and some people began to drop in, till 18 were assembled, including the sub-chief and several very grand-looking old men, with full, grey, wavy beards. Age is held in much reverence, and it is etiquette for these old men to do honour to a guest in the chief's absence. As each entered, he saluted me several times, and after sitting down turned towards me and saluted again, going through the same ceremony with every other person. They said they had come to bid me welcome. They took their places in rigid order at each side of the fireplace, which is 6 feet long, Benri's mother in the place of honour at the right, then Shinondi, then the sub-chief, and on the other side the old men. Besides these, 7 women sat in a row in the background splitting bark. A large iron pan hung over the fire from a blackened arrangement above, and Benri's principal wife cut wild roots, green beans, and seaweed, and shred dried fish and venison among them, adding millet, water, and some strong-smelling fish oil, and set the whole on to stew for 3 hours, stirring the mess now and then with a wooden spoon. Several of the older people smoke, and I handed round some mild tobacco, which they received with waving hands. I told them that I came from a land in the sea, very far away, where they saw the sun go down, so very far away that a horse would have to gallop day and night for 5 weeks to reach it, and that I had come a long journey to see them, and that I wanted to ask them many questions, so that when I went home I might tell my own people something about them. Shinondi and another man, who understood Japanese, bowed and, as on every occasion, translated what I said into Ainu for the venerable group opposite. Shinondi then said that he and Shinrichi, the other Japanese speaker, would tell me all they knew, but they were but young men and only knew what was told to them. They would speak what they believed to be true, but the chief knew more than they, and when he came back he might tell me differently, and then I should think that they had spoken lies. I said that no one who looked into their faces could think that they ever told lies. They were very much pleased and waved their hands and stroked their beards repeatedly. Before they told me anything, they begged and prayed that I would not inform the Japanese government that they had told me of their customs, or harm might come to them. For the next 2 hours, and for 2 more after supper, I asked them questions concerning their religion and customs, and again yesterday for a considerable time, and this morning, after Benri's return, I went over the same subjects with him, and have also employed a considerable time in getting about 300 words from them, which I have spelt phonetically, of course, and intend to go over again when I visit the coast Ainos. The process was slow, as both question and answer had to pass through 3 languages. There was a very manifest desire to tell the truth, and I think that their statements concerning their few and simple customs may be relied upon. I shall give what they told me separately when I have time to write out my notes in an orderly manner. I can only say that I have seldom spent a more interesting evening. About 9 the stew was ready, and the women ladled it onto lacquer bowls with wooden spoons. The men were served first, but all ate together. Afterwards, sake, their curse, was poured into lacquer bowls, and across each bowl a finely carved sake stick was laid. These sticks are very highly prized. The bowls were waved several times with an inward motion, then each man took his stick and, dipping it into the sake, made 6 libations to the fire and several to the god, a wooden post with a quantity of spiral white shavings falling from near the top. The Ainos are not affected by sake nearly so easily as the Japanese. They took it cold, it is true, but each drank about 3 times as much as would have made a Japanese foolish, and it had no effect upon them. After 2 hours more talk, one after another got up and went out, making profuse salutations to me and to the others. My candles had been forgotten, and our séance was held by the fitful light of the big logs on the fire, aided by a succession of chips of birch bark, with which a woman replenished a cleft stick that was stuck into the fire hole. I never saw such a strangely picturesque sight as that group of magnificent savages with the fitful firelight on their faces, and for adjuncts the flare of the torch, the strong lights, the blackness of the recesses of the room and of the roof, at one end of which the stars looked in, and the row of savage women in the background. Eastern savagery and Western civilization met in this hut, savagery giving and civilization receiving, the yellow-skinned Ito the connecting link between the two, and the representative of a civilization to which our own is but an infant of days. I found it very exciting, and when all had left, crept out into the starlight. The lodges were all dark and silent, and the dogs, mild like their masters, took no notice of me. The only sound was the rustle of a light breeze through the surrounding forest. The verse came into my mind: "It is not the will of your Father which is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish." Surely these simple savages are children, as children to be judged. May we not hope as children to be saved through Him who came not to judge the world, but to save the world? I crept back again and into my mosquito net, and suffered not from fleas or mosquitoes, but from severe cold. Shinondi conversed with Ito for some time in a low musical voice, having previously asked if it would keep me from sleeping. No Japanese ever intermitted his ceaseless chatter at any hour of the night for a similar reason. Later the chief's principal wife, Noma, stuck a triply cleft stick in the fire hole, put a potsherd with a wick and some fish oil upon it, and by the dim light of this rude lamp sewed until midnight at a garment of bark cloth, which she was ornamenting for her lord with strips of blue cloth, and when I opened my eyes the next morning she was at the window sewing by the earliest daylight. She is the most intelligent looking of all the women, but looks sad and almost stern, and speaks seldom. Although she is the principal wife of the chief, she is not happy, for she is childless, and I thought that her sad look darkened into something evil as the other wife caressed a fine baby boy. Benri seems to me something of a brute, and the mother-in-law obviously holds the reins of government pretty tight. After sewing till midnight she swept the mats with a bunch of twigs, and then crept into her bed behind a hanging mat. For a moment in the stillness I felt a feeling of panic, as if I were incurring a risk by being alone among savages, but I conquered it, and, after watching the fire till it went out, fell asleep till I was awoke by the severe cold of the next day's dawn. End of section 44. Of Unbeaten Tracks in Japan by Isabella L. Bird. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Availle in September 2012. Letter 36, Part 2. When I crept from under my net much benumbed with cold, there were about 11 people in the room, who all made their graceful salutation. It did not seem as if they had ever heard of washing, for when water was asked for, Shinondi brought a little in a lacquer bowl, and held it while I bathed my face and hands, supposing the performance to be an act of worship. I was about to throw some cold tea out of the window by my bed, when he arrested me with an anxious face, and I saw, what I had not observed before, that there was a god at that window, a stick with festoons of shavings hanging from it, and beside it a dead bird. The Ainos have 2 meals a day, and their breakfast was a repetition of the previous night's supper. We all ate together, and I gave the children the remains of my rice, and it was most amusing to see little creatures of 3, 4, and 5 years old, with no other clothing than a piece of pewter hanging round their necks, first formally asking leave of the parents before taking the rice, and then waving their hands. The obedience of the children is instantaneous. The parents are more demonstrative in their affection than the Japanese are, caressing them a good deal, and 2 of the men are devoted to children who are not their own. These little ones are as grave and dignified as Japanese children, and are very gentle. I went out soon after 5, when the dew was glittering in the sunshine, and the mountain hollow in which Biratori stands was looking its very best, and the silence of the place, even though the people were all astir, was as impressive as that of the night before. What a strange life! Knowing nothing, hoping nothing, fearing a little, the need for clothes and food the one motive principle, sake in abundance the one good. How very few points of contact it is possible to have! I was just thinking so when Shinondi met me and took me to his house to see if I could do anything for a child sorely afflicted with skin disease, and his extreme tenderness for this very loathsome object made me feel that human affections were the same among them as with us. He had carried it on his back from a village 5 miles distant that morning, in the hope that it might be cured. As soon as I entered, he laid a fine mat on the floor and covered the guest seat with a bearskin. After breakfast he took me to the lodge of the sub-chief, the largest in the village, 45 feet square, and into about 20 others, all constructed in the same way, but some of them were not more than 20 feet square. In all I was received with the same courtesy, but a few of the people asked Shinondi not to take me into their houses, as they did not want me to see how poor they are. In every house there was a low shelf with more or fewer curios upon it, but besides these none but the barest necessities of life, though the skins which they sell or barter every year would enable them to surround themselves with comforts, were it not that their gains represent to them sake and nothing else. They are not nomads. On the contrary, they cling tenaciously to the sites on which their fathers have lived and died. But anything more deplorable than the attempts at cultivation which surround their lodges could not be seen. The soil is little better than white sand, on which without manure they attempt to grow millet, which is to them in the place of rice, pumpkins, onions, and tobacco, but the look of their plots is as if they had been cultivated 10 years ago, and some chance-sown grain and vegetables had come up among the weeds. When nothing more will grow, they partially clear another bit of forest, and exhaust that in its turn. In every house the same honor was paid to a guest. This seems a savage virtue which is not strong enough to survive much contact with civilization. Before I entered one lodge, the woman brought several of the finer mats and arranged them as a pathway for me to walk to the fire upon. They will not accept anything for lodging or for anything that they give, so I was anxious to help them by buying some of their handiwork, but found even this a difficult matter. They were very anxious to give, but when I desired to buy, they said they did not wish to part with their things. I wanted what they had in actual use, such as a tobacco box and pipe sheath, and knives with carved handles and scabbards, and for 3 of these I offered $2.50. They said that they did not care to sell them, but in the evening they came saying they were not worth more than $1.10, and they would sell them for that, and I could not get them to take more. They said it was not their custom. I bought a bow and 3 poisoned arrows, 2 reed mats with a diamond pattern on them in reeds stained red, some knives with sheaths, and a bark cloth dress. I tried to buy the sake sticks with which they make libations to their gods, but they said it was not their custom to part with the sake stick of any living man. However, this morning Shinondi has brought me, as a very valuable present, the stick of a dead man. This morning the man who sold the arrows brought 2 new ones to replace 2 which were imperfect. I found them, as Mr. von Siebold had done, punctiliously honest in all their transactions. They wear very large earrings with hoops 1.5 inches in diameter, a pair constituting the dowry of an Ainu bride, but they would not part with these. A house was burned down 2 nights ago, and custom in such a case requires that all the men should work at rebuilding it. So in their absence I got 2 boys to take me in a dug-out as far as we could go up the Sarufutogawa, a lovely river which winds tortuously through the forests and mountains in unspeakable loveliness. I had much of the feeling of the ancient mariner. We were the first who ever burst into that silent sea. For certainly no European had ever previously floated on the dark and forest-shrouded waters. I enjoyed those hours thoroughly, for the silence was profound, and the faint blue of the autumn sky and the soft blue veil which spiritualized the distances were so exquisitely like the Indian summer. The evening was spent like the previous one, but the hearts of the savages were sad, for there was no more sake in Biratori, so they could not "drink to the god," and the fire and the post with the shavings had to go without libations. There was no more oil, so after the strangers retired the hut was in complete darkness. Yesterday morning we all breakfasted soon after daylight, and the able-bodied men went away to hunt. Hunting and fishing are their occupations, and for indoor recreation they carve tobacco boxes, knife sheaths, sake sticks, and shuttles. It is quite unnecessary for them to do anything; they are quite contented to sit by the fire and smoke occasionally, and eat and sleep, this apathy being varied by spasms of activity when there is no more dried fish in the kuras, and when skins must be taken to Sarufuto to pay for sake. The women seem never to have an idle moment. They rise early to sew, weave, and split bark, for they not only clothe themselves and their husbands in this nearly indestructible cloth, but weave it for barter, and the lower class of Japanese are constantly to be seen wearing the product of Aino industry. They do all the hard work, such as drawing water, chopping wood, grinding millet, and cultivating the soil, after their fashion, but, to do the men justice, I often see them trudging along carrying 1 and even 2 children. The women take the exclusive charge of the kuras, which are never entered by men. I was left for some hours alone with the women, of whom there were 7 in the hut, with a few children. On the one side of the fire, the chief's mother sat like a fate, for ever splitting and knotting bark, and petrifying me by her cold, fateful eyes. Her thick grey hair hangs in shocks, the tattooing round her mouth has nearly faded, and no longer disguises her really handsome features. She is dressed in a much ornamented bark-cloth dress, and wears 2 silver beads tied round her neck by a piece of blue cotton, in addition to very large earrings. She has much sway in the house, sitting on the men's side of the fire, drinking plenty of sake, and occasionally chiding her grandson Shinondi for telling me too much, saying that it will bring harm to her people. Though her expression is so severe and forbidding, she is certainly very handsome, and it is a European, not an Asiatic beauty. The younger women were all at work. 2 were seated on the floor, weaving without a loom, and the others were making and mending the bark coats which are worn by both sexes. Noma, the chief's principal wife, sat apart, seldom speaking. 2 of the youngest women are very pretty, as fair as ourselves, and their comeliness is of the rosy peasant kind. It turns out that 2 of them, though they would not divulge it before men, speak Japanese, and they prattled to Ito with great vivacity and merriment, the ancient fate scowling at them the while from under her shaggy eyebrows. I got a number of words from them, and they laughed heartily at my erroneous pronunciation. They even asked me a number of questions regarding their own sex among ourselves, but few of these would bear repetition, and they answered a number of mine. As the merriment increased, the old woman looked increasingly angry and restless, and at last rated them sharply, as I have heard since, telling them that if they spoke another word she should tell her husbands that they had been talking to strangers. After this not another word was spoken, and Noma, who is an industrious housewife, boiled some millet into a mash for a midday lunch. During the afternoon a very handsome young Ainu with a washed, richly coloured skin and fine clear eyes came up from the coast where he had been working at the fishing. He saluted the old woman and Benri's wife on entering, and presented the former with a gourd of sake, bringing a greedy light into her eyes as she took a long draught, after which, saluting me, he threw himself down in the place of honour by the fire, with the easy grace of a staghound, a savage all over. His name is Pipichari, and he is the chief's adopted son. He had cut his foot badly with a root and asked me to cure it, and I stipulated that it should be bathed for some time in warm water before anything more was done, after which I bandaged it with lint. He said he did not like me to touch his foot, it was not clean enough, my hands were too white, etc., but when I had dressed it and the pain was much relieved, he bowed very low and then kissed my hand. He was the only one among them all who showed the slightest curiosity regarding my things. He looked at my scissors, touched my boots, and watched me as I wrote, with the simple curiosity of a child. He could speak a little Japanese, but he said he was too young to tell me anything, the older men would know. He is a total abstainer from sake, and he says that there are 4 such besides himself among the large number of Ainos who are just now at the fishing at Mombetsu, and that the others keep separate from them, because they think that the gods will be angry with them for not drinking. Several patients, mostly children, were brought in during the afternoon. Ito was much disgusted by my interest in these people, who, he repeated, are just dogs, referring to the legendary origin, of which they are not ashamed. His assertion that they have learned politeness from the Japanese is simply baseless. Their politeness, though of quite another and more manly stamp, is savage, not civilized. The men came back at dark, the meal was prepared, and we sat round the fire as before, but there was no sake, except in the possession of the old woman, and again the hearts of the savages were sad. I could multiply instances of their politeness. As we were talking, Pipichari, who is a very untutored savage, dropped his coat from one shoulder, and at once Shinondi signed to him to put it on again. Again, a woman was sent to a distant village for some oil as soon as they heard that I usually burnt a light all night. Little acts of courtesy were constantly being performed, but I really appreciated nothing more than the quiet way in which they went on with the routine of their ordinary lives. During the evening a man came to ask if I would go and see a woman who could hardly breathe, and I found her very ill of bronchitis, accompanied with much fever. She was lying in a coat of skins, tossing on the hard boards of her bed, with a matting-covered roll under her head, and her husband was trying to make her swallow some salt fish. I took her dry, hot hand, such a small hand, tattooed all over the back, and it gave me a strange thrill. The room was full of people, and they all seemed very sorry. A medical missionary would be of little use here, but a medically trained nurse, who would give medicines and proper food with proper nursing, would save many lives and much suffering. It is of no use to tell these people to do anything which requires to be done more than once, they are just like children. I gave her some chlorodyne, which she swallowed with difficulty, and left another dose ready mixed to give her in a few hours, but about midnight they came to tell me that she was worse, and on going I found her very cold and weak, and breathing very hard, moving her head wearily from side to side. I thought she could not live for many hours, and was much afraid that they would think that I had killed her. I told them that I thought she would die, but they urged me to do something more for her, and as a last hope I gave her some brandy, with 25 drops of chlorodyne and a few spoonfuls of very strong beef tea. She was unable, or more probably unwilling, to make the effort to swallow it, and I poured it down her throat by the wild glare of strips of birch bark. An hour later they came back to tell me that she felt as if she were very drunk, but going back to her house I found that she was sleeping quietly and breathing more easily, and, creeping back just at dawn, I found her still sleeping and with her pulse stronger and calmer. She is now decidedly better and quite sensible, and her husband, the sub-chief, is much delighted. It seems so sad that they have nothing fit for a sick person's food, and though I have made a bowl of beef tea with the remains of my stock, it can only last one day. I was so tired with these nocturnal expeditions and anxieties that on lying down I fell asleep, and on waking found more than the usual assemblage in the room, and the men were obviously agog about something. They have a singular, and I hope an unreasonable, fear of the Japanese government. Mr. von Siebold thinks that the officials threaten and knock them about, and this is possible, but I really think that the Kaitaikushi department means well by them, and, besides removing the oppressive restrictions by which, as a conquered race, they were fettered, treats them far more humanely and equitably than the U.S. government, for instance, treats the North American Indians. However, they are ignorant, and one of the men, who had been most grateful because I said I would get Dr. Hepburn to send some medicine for his child, came this morning and begged me not to do so. He said the Japanese government would be angry. After this, they again prayed me not to tell the Japanese government that they had told me their customs, and then they began to talk earnestly together. The sub-chief then spoke, and said that I had been kind to their sick people, and they would like to show me their temple, which had never been seen by any foreigner, but they were very much afraid of doing so, and they asked me many times not to tell the Japanese government that they showed it to me, lest some great harm should happen to them. The sub-chief put on a sleeveless Japanese war cloak to go up, and he, Shinondi, Pipichari, and 2 others accompanied me. It was a beautiful but very steep walk, or rather climb, to the top of an abrupt acclivity beyond the village, on which the temple or shrine stands. It would be impossible to get up, were it not for the remains of a wooden staircase, not of Ainu construction. Forest and mountain surround Biratori, and the only breaks in the dense greenery are glints of the shining waters of the Sarufutogawa and the tawny roofs of the Ainu lodges. It is a lonely and a silent land, fitter for the hiding place than the dwelling place of man. When the splendid young savage Pipichari saw that I found it difficult to get up, he took my hand and helped me up, as gently as an English gentleman would have done, and when he saw that I had greater difficulty in getting down, he all but insisted on my riding down on his back, and certainly would have carried me, had not Benri, the chief, who arrived while we were at the shrine, made an end of it by taking my hand and helping me down himself. Their instinct of helpfulness to a foreign woman strikes me as so odd, because they never show any courtesy to their own women, whom they treat, though to a less extent than is usual among savages, as inferior beings. On the very edge of the cliff, at the top of the zigzag, stands a wooden temple or shrine, such as one sees in any grove or on any high place on the main island, obviously of Japanese construction, but concerning which Aino tradition is silent. No European had ever stood where I stood, and there was a solemnity in the knowledge. The sub-chief drew back the sliding doors, and all bowed with much reverence. It was a simple shrine of unlacquered wood, with a broad shelf at the back, on which there was a small shrine containing a figure of the historical hero Yoshitsune, in a suit of inlaid brass armor, some metal gohei, a pair of tarnished brass candlesticks, and a colored Chinese picture representing a junk. Here, then, I was introduced to the great god of the mountain Ainos. There is something very pathetic in these people keeping alive the memory of Yoshitsune, not on account of his martial exploits, but simply because their tradition tells them that he was kind to them. They pulled the bell 3 times to attract his attention, bowed 3 times, and made 6 libations of sake, without which ceremony he cannot be approached. They asked me to worship their god, but when I declined on the ground that I could only worship my own god, the Lord of earth and heaven, of the dead and of the living, they were too courteous to press their request. As to Ito, it did not signify to him whether or not he added another god to his already crowded pantheon, and he worshipped, that is, bowed down, most willingly before the great hero of his own, the conquering race. While we were crowded there on the narrow ledge of the cliff, Benri, the chief, arrived, a square-built, broad-shouldered, elderly man, strong as an ox, and very handsome, but his expression is not pleasing, and his eyes are bloodshot with drinking. The others saluted him very respectfully, but I noticed then and since that his manner is very arbitrary, and that a blow not infrequently follows a word. He had sent a message to his people by Ito that they were not to answer any questions till he returned, but Ito very tactfully neither gave it nor told me of it, and he was displeased with the young man for having talked to me so much. His mother had evidently peached. I like him less than any of his tribe. He has some fine qualities, truthfulness among others, but he has been contaminated by the 4 or 5 foreigners that he has seen, and is a brute and a sot. The hearts of his people are no longer sad, for there is sake in every house tonight. ILB. End of section 45. Of Unbeaten Tracks in Japan by Isabella L. Bird. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Availle in September 2012. Letter 37, Part 1. Biratori, Yezo, August 24th. I expected to have written out my notes on the Ainos in the comparative quiet and comfort of Sarufuto, but a delay in Benri's return and the non-arrival of the horses have compelled me to accept Ainu hospitality for another night, which involves living on tea and potatoes, for my stock of food is exhausted. In some respects I am glad to remain longer, as it enables me to go over my stock of words, as well as my notes, with the chief, who is intelligent, and it is a pleasure to find that his statements confirm those which have been made by the young man. The glamour which at first disguises the inherent barrenness of savage life has had time to pass away, and I see it in all its nakedness as a life not much raised above the necessities of animal existence, timid, monotonous, barren of good, dark, dull, without hope, and without God in the world, though at its lowest and worst considerably higher and better than that of many other aboriginal races, and, must I say it, considerably higher and better than that of thousands of the lapsed masses of our own great cities, who are baptized into Christ's name and are laid at last in holy ground, inasmuch as the Ainos are truthful and, on the whole, chaste, hospitable, honest, reverent, and kind to the aged. Drinking, their great vice, is not, as among us, in antagonism to their religion, but is actually a part of it, and as such would be exceptionally difficult to eradicate. The early darkness has once again come on, and once again the elders have assembled round the fire in 2 long lines, with the younger men at the ends, Pipichari, who yesterday sat in the place of honor and was helped to food first as the newest arrival, taking his place as the youngest at the end of the right-hand row. The birch bark chips beam with fitful glare, the evening sake bowls are filled, the fire god and the garlanded god receive their libations, the ancient woman, still sitting like a fate, splits bark, and the younger women knot it, and the log fire lights up as magnificent a set of venerable heads a painter or sculptor would desire to see, heads full of what? They have no history, their traditions are scarcely worthy the name, they claim descent from a dog, their houses and persons swarm with vermin, they are sunk in the grossest ignorance, they have no letters or any numbers above 1,000, they are clothed in the bark of trees and the untanned skins of beasts, they worship the bear, the sun, moon, fire, water, and I know not what. They are uncivilizable and altogether irreclaimable savages. Yet they are attractive and in some ways fascinating, and I hope I shall never forget the music of their low, sweet voices, the soft light of their mild brown eyes, and the wonderful sweetness of their smile. After the yellow skins, the stiff horsehair, the feeble eyelids, the elongated eyes, the sloping eyebrows, the flat noses, the sunken chests, the Mongolian features, the puny physique, the shaky walk of the men, the restricted totter of the women, and the general impression of degeneracy conveyed by the appearance of the Japanese, the Ainos make a very singular impression. All but 2 or 3 that I have seen are the most ferocious looking of savages, with a physique vigorous enough for carrying out the most ferocious intentions, but as soon as they speak the countenance brightens into a smile as gentle as that of a woman, something which can never be forgotten. The men are about the middle height, broad-chested, broad-shouldered, thick-set, very strongly built, the arms and legs short, thick, and muscular, the hands and feet large. The bodies, and especially the limbs, of many are covered with short bristly hair. I have seen 2 boys whose backs are covered with fur as fine and soft as that of a cat. The heads and faces are very striking. The foreheads are very high, broad, and prominent, and at first sight give one the impression of an unusual capacity for intellectual development. The ears are small and set low, the noses are straight but short, and broad at the nostrils, the mouths are wide but well formed, and the lips rarely show a tendency to fullness. The neck is short, the cranium rounded, the cheekbones low, and the lower part of the face is small as compared with the upper, the peculiarity called a jowl being unknown. The eyebrows are full and form a straight line nearly across the face. The eyes are large, tolerably deeply set, and very beautiful, the color a rich liquid brown, the expression singularly soft, and the eyelashes long, silky, and abundant. The skin has the Italian olive tint, but in most cases is thin and light enough to show the changes of color in the cheek. The teeth are small, regular, and very white. The incisors and eye teeth are not disproportionately large, as is usually the case among the Japanese. There is no tendency towards prognathism, and the fold of integument, which conceals the upper eyelids of the Japanese, is never to be met with. The features, expression, and aspect are European rather than Asiatic. The ferocious savagery of the appearance of the man is produced by a profusion of thick, soft, black hair, divided in the middle, and falling in heavy masses nearly to the shoulders. Out of doors it is kept from falling over the face by a fillet round the brow. The beards are equally profuse, quite magnificent, and generally wavy, and in the case of the old man they give a truly patriarchal and venerable aspect, in spite of the yellow tinge produced by smoke and want of cleanliness. The savage look produced by the masses of hair and beard and the thick eyebrows is mitigated by the softness in the dreamy brown eyes, and is altogether obliterated by the exceeding sweetness of the smile, which belongs in greater or less degree to all the rougher sex. I have measured the height of 30 of the adult men of this village, and it ranges from 5 feet 4 inches to 5 feet 6½ inches. The circumference of the heads averages 22.1 inches, and the arc from ear to ear 13 inches. According to Mr. Davies, the average weight of the Ainu adult masculine brain, ascertained by measurement of Ainu skulls, is 45.90 ounces avoirdupois, a brain weight said to exceed that of all the races, Hindu and Mussulman, on the Indian plains, and that of the aboriginal races of India and Ceylon, and is only paralleled by that of the races of the Himalayas, the Siamese, and the Chinese Burmese. Mr. Davis says, further, that it exceeds the mean brain weight of Asiatic races in general. Yet, with all this, the Ainos are a stupid people. Passing travellers who have seen a few of the Aino women on the road to Satsuporo speak of them as very ugly, but as making amends for their ugliness by their industry and conjugal fidelity. Of the latter there is no doubt, but I am not disposed to admit the former. The ugliness is certainly due to art and dirt. The Aino women seldom exceed 5 feet and half an inch in height, but they are beautifully formed, straight, lithe, and well developed, with small feet and hands, well arched insteps, rounded limbs, well developed busts, and a firm elastic gait. Their heads and faces are small, but the hair, which falls in masses on each side of the face like that of the man, is equally redundant. They have superb teeth, and display them liberally in smiling. Their mouths are somewhat wide, but well formed, and they have a ruddy comeliness about them which is pleasing, in spite of the disfigurement of the band which is tattooed both above and below the mouth, and which, by being united at the corners, enlarges its apparent size and width. A girl at Shiraoi, who for some reason has not been subjected to this process, is the most beautiful creature in features, colouring, and natural grace of form that I have seen for a long time. Their complexions are lighter than those of the men. There are not many here even as dark as our European brunettes. A few unite the eyebrows by a streak of tattooing, so as to produce a straight line. Like the men, they cut their hair short for 2 or 3 inches above the nape of the neck, but instead of using a fillet, they take 2 locks from the front and tie them at the back. They are universally tattooed, not only with the broad band above and below the mouth, but with a band across the knuckles, succeeded by an elaborate pattern on the back of the hand, and a series of bracelets extending to the elbow. The process of disfigurement begins at the age of 5, when some of the sufferers are yet unweaned. I saw the operation performed on a dear little bright girl this morning. A woman took a large knife with a sharp edge, and rapidly cut several horizontal lines on the upper lip, following closely the curve of the very pretty mouth, and before the slight bleeding had ceased, carefully rubbed in some of the shiny soot which collects on the mat above the fire. In 2 or 3 days the scarred lip will be washed with the decoction of the bark of a tree to fix the pattern, and give it that blue look which makes many people mistake it for a daub of paint. A child who had this second process performed yesterday has her lip fearfully swollen and inflamed. The latest victim held her hands clasped tightly together while the cuts were inflicted, but never cried. The pattern on the lips is deepened and widened every year up to the time of marriage, and the circles on the arm are extended in a similar way. The man cannot give any reason for the universality of this custom. It is an old custom, they say, and part of their religion, and no woman could marry without it. Penri fancies that the Japanese custom of blackening the teeth is equivalent to it, but he is mistaken, as that ceremony usually succeeds marriage. They begin to tattoo the arms when a girl is 5 or 6, and work from the elbow downwards. They express themselves as very much grieved and tormented by the recent prohibition of tattooing. They say the gods will be angry, and that the women can't marry unless they are tattooed, and they implored both Mr. von Siebold and me to intercede with the Japanese government on their behalf in this respect. They are less apathetic on this than on any subject, and repeat frequently, "It's a part of our religion." The children are very pretty and attractive, and their faces give promise of an intelligence which is lacking in those of the adults. They are much loved and are caressing as well as caressed. The infants of the mountain Ainos have seeds of millet put into their mouths as soon as they are born, and those of the coast Ainos a morsel of saltfish, and whatever be the hour of birth, custom requires that they shall not be fed until a night has passed. They are not weaned until they are at least 3 years old. Boys are preferred to girls, but both are highly valued, and a childless wife may be divorced. Children do not receive names till they are 4 or 5 years old, and then the father chooses a name by which his child is afterwards known. Young children, when they travel, are either carried on their mothers' backs in a net, or in the back of the loose garment, but in both cases the weight is mainly supported by a broad band which passes round the woman's forehead. When men carry them, they hold them in their arms. The hair of very young children is shaven, and from about 5 to 15 the boys wear either a large tonsure or tufts above the ears, while the girls are allowed to grow hair all over their heads. Implicit and prompt obedience is required from infancy, and from a very early age the children are utilized by being made to fetch and carry and go on messages. I have seen children apparently not more than 2 years old sent for wood, and even at this age they are so thoroughly trained in the observances of etiquette that babies just able to walk never toddle into or out of this house without formal salutations to each person within it, the mother alone excepted. They don't wear any clothing till they are 7 or 8 years old, and are then dressed like their elders. Their manners to their parents are very affectionate. Even today, in the chief's awe-inspiring presence, one dear little nude creature, who had been sitting quietly for 2 hours staring into the fire with her big brown eyes, rushed to meet her mother when she entered, and threw her arms round her, to which the woman responded by a look of true maternal tenderness and a kiss. These little creatures, in the absolute unconsciousness of innocence, with their beautiful faces, olive-tinted bodies, all the darker, sad to say, from dirt, their perfect docility and absence of prying curiosity are very bewitching. They all wear silver or pewter ornaments tied round their necks by a wisp of blue cotton. Apparently the ordinary infantile maladies, such as whooping cough and measles, do not afflict the Ainos fatally, but the children suffer from a cutaneous affection which wears off as they reach the age of 10 or 11 years, as well as from severe toothache with their first teeth. End of section 46.